Good morning. I'm Dr. Charles Patterson, the interim president at Georgia Southwestern State University, and it's my honor to welcome all of our guests, certainly our students that are in attendance, faculty, staff, and members of our community to the beautiful campus of Georgia Southwestern State University. I'd like to thank the National Park Service, Friends of Andersonville, and the Andersonville National Historic Site for all of that you do in honoring all those that have served valiantly in the theater of war. Also, thank you to Superintendent Charles Sellers, who's here in attendance today, Chief of Interpretation Jody Mays, for your service and commitment to the ride home. Mr. Ryan Anglin from the Secretary of State's office is also here in attendance today. Thank you, Ryan, for attending on behalf of the Secretary. And certainly thank you to Mo Moyer, the chief of all that is done here for the POW and MIAs. And special thanks to the former POWs, families, and escorts that are here in attendance today, making sure that they are recognized and honored. You know, we're so very proud of Georgia Southwestern State University. Today, we will start planning for marking our 110th anniversary as a university, 110 years in existence. But just last year, we had a year of anniversaries, marking the 150th anniversary of the Civil War and the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II and the 40th anniversary of the end of the Vietnam War. Each year we gather to remember former POWs, MIAs, and their families. We remember and recognize and pay tribute to the sacrifice of others so that we may be free in one of the greatest nations on the planet. And every year we recommit ourselves to making sure that those who do not come home at the end of the war are remembered and never forgotten. We're pleased to show the university's commitment, this being our 11th year, to host the ride home and to recognize and pay tribute to the prisoners of war and those missing in action. I thank you for being here with us this morning to remember them with us. May God bless you, bless your families, and bless this great nation in many years to come. Now please help me welcome Ms. Jody Mays, the Chief of Interpretation.
Thank you, Dr. Patterson. I'm very glad to be here today to introduce our featured speaker. I do work at Andersonville National Historic Site, which is just a short distance from here, 10 or 12 miles. Hopefully some of you have been there. Andersonville is best known for the Civil War prison site that was there from 1864 to 1865. It became known as a place of tragedy for prisoners of war that were held there. The approximately 45,000 American soldiers that were held there during its 14-month operation, about 13,000 of those died there. And so that became symbolic of the tragedy and suffering of prisoners of war in America. As part of that, Andersonville has become more. We also have the Andersonville National Cemetery, which is still an active burial area where military veterans and their loved ones can be buried, and still are. And we also have an added mission that's an important part of Andersonville National Historic Site. We are home to the National Prisoner of War Museum. And in fact, Andersonville National Historic Site is the only National Park Service site that has been given the mission of preserving and interpreting the stories of all American prisoners of war throughout history, from the Revolutionary War to today. And so it is our privilege and honor to help honor and preserve and interpret those stories of all American prisoners of war. As such, it is very appropriate and important for us to participate and partner with the Ride Home in their efforts at this time of year. The National POW and MIA Recognition Day is one of our most important annual events that we do in partnership with the Ride Home, and we are very proud to be a part of that. We have this ceremony today, and we will have a ceremony on Friday at the National Prisoner of War Museum to have members of the former USS Pueblo crew who were held prisoner for about 11 months in 1968, and other former POWs, MIA family members, and others gather at the National Prisoner of War Museum to rededicate a plaque honoring the members of the USS Pueblo. And that will be Friday at 9 a.m. If you would like to join us, we would welcome you to do that. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Derek Mallett. Dr. Mallett earned a bachelor's degree in history and political science from Culver Stockton College in Canton, Missouri. He earned 2 Master of Arts degrees in history and education, respectively, from Truman State University in Kirksville, Missouri. And most recently, he earned a Ph.D. in history from Texas A&M University in College Station, Texas. Dr. Mallett has 15 years of teaching experience, including teaching courses in American history, world history, military history, and Asian civilizations at institutions ranging from a public high school and community colleges to 2 state universities and the professional military education system. Dr. Mallett spent 3 years as a research historian for the former Joint Prisoner of War and Missing in Action Accounting Command in Honolulu, Hawaii. His research interests focus on the Second World War and the early Cold War, and on prisoner of war studies in particular. And he's joining us today. He's currently an assistant professor of military history in Fort Gordon, Georgia. And he's joining us today to talk about his work with the Joint Prisoner of War and Missing in Action Accounting Command. Would you please help me welcome Dr. Derek Mallett?
Good morning. Hope everyone's doing well. I'll try not to get too close so I don't set that off anymore. So I'm gonna set a phone out here, not because I plan to call anybody, but just so I don't run too long. So I don't want to stand in anybody's way of getting to lunch. So that's I've learned from my students. Thank you very much for the introduction, by the way. I appreciate that. I now teach for the U.S. Army, so I know when it's I've got the late morning class that when noontime comes, I got to curtail things. So. Anyway, so yes, what I want to speak to you about today is the experience that I had. I spent 3 years as a research historian for what used to be called JPAC, the Joint Prisoner of War Missing in Action Accounting Command. It's now called the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency. They're good at rebranding themselves. They've done it several times over the years. And I'll talk a little bit about that mission and the importance of that mission and how much the men and women who work there value that mission and see the importance of repatriating the remains and identifying, accounting for all of the missing service members from America's past wars. But let me start with a story. So again, I worked in the World War II section, so that's what I know about JPAC best. But in 1945, in April of 45, there was a B-17, the 9-member crew that was sent to target Oranienburg, Germany. Oranienburg's about 10 miles north of Berlin, so this is obviously beyond the American lines. The plane dropped its payload over Oranienburg and it was immediately met by German Messerschmitt fighters. It was heavily damaged. It was all the plane could do to make it out of Oranienburg. It limped along in the air for about 15 to 20 miles before it broke apart and crashed in a lake about 30 miles northeast of Berlin. So at the time, there were 2 members of the crew that managed to parachute out of the bomber. One of those was immediately captured by the Germans, spent what little was left of the war in Europe as a prisoner of war, and survived the war and returned to come home and tell the tale. The second one, who parachuted out, was also captured but attempted to escape and was shot in the process and killed. And so he ended up losing his life anyway, despite escaping the plane. But what's interesting about the case, and the reason I share this story, is because it really exemplifies a lot of the challenges that we found in trying to identify and account for the missing. And so we could immediately account for 2 of these, of the 9-member crew. The plane crashes in a lake. Well, 5 bodies floated up to the surface of the lake, were buried at the time by German locals. American authorities, the American Graves Registration Service, did a pretty comprehensive sweep after the war to try to pick up all of the American remains that they could find. They could identify 4 of the 5. So 4 of them were identified and buried accurately. The 5th, and again, this exemplifies a lot of the crazy challenges that we had and still have identifying remains, but they couldn't identify the remains because, as you may know, in World War II, service members wore clothing, including their underwear, that was stamped with their name and serial numbers. And this gentleman had clothing on that did not match, so he had missed like 2 different names and serial numbers on his person. And at least one of the names did not match his physical profile. So this actually wasn't that uncommon. The Marines apparently loved to swap dog tags before they went into battle. So at Tarawa, they all switched their dog tags around, and then we promptly lost hundreds of them, and then we couldn't identify them immediately because everybody's dog tag was their buddy, right? So again, exemplifies one of the issues that we dealt with at the time. So this particular set of remains was buried as unknown or known but to God, right? And there are 25 American military cemeteries around the world, and many of them have sections for unknown sets of remains. But what you wind up with in the end of the story is, or near the end of the story, is you got 6 of the 9 crew members accounted for and 1 set of unknown remains. So you've got 3 candidates for 1 set of remains and obviously 2 sets of remains missing. And then to further complicate the thing, there was a second B-17 that the plane crashed too far away to have been, for any of those who parachuted out, to have been candidates for this set of remains. But 1 member of their crew had bailed out in an area that, had he drifted a certain way, he could have wound up in the same area and maybe landed in this lake. So we got 3 members from 1 crew and 1 member from a second crew that are all potential matches for this set of unknown remains. And that's where the case stood about 1952, and it's basically sat dormant for decades, okay? So we'll pick up with that here momentarily. I got to save the suspense till the end so nobody decides to get up and take off. All right, so anyway, the overall point I want to make about this is the 3 years that I spent at JPAC really impressed upon me, again, the importance of this mission. And I can't tell you how much the people who work there feel the importance, feel the weight of it, and want to bring America's service members home. And I think the mission is a really unique one, even internationally. So if you follow, which as I know many of you must, if you follow JPAC, DPAA, you know there are, of course, lots of political controversies with them, and they've been reorganized, and they get a lot of bad press. Honestly, some of it deservedly so, but that's not the point of this talk today. So, but a lot of that is leadership issues, but the men and women, the overwhelming majority of the people who work there are so dedicated to the task and really feel its importance. And again, I feel like it's a unique mission because if you compare it to our international partners, the U.S. has a more comprehensive goal in correctly identifying and bringing home service members, more so than almost any other nation on Earth at this point in time. So I'll get back to that a little bit more later on. There's a couple of countries that have somewhat similar efforts, but I think the U.S. is a pretty elite company in trying to do that. So currently, there are still 73,121 people, service members, officially listed as missing or unaccounted for from World War II alone. 73,000, okay? The Korean War still has 7,805. The Vietnam War, officially they simply say over 1,600. DPAA does not offer an official accounting currently. The Cold War, defined broadly, is missing 126, or 126 unaccounted for. And then current Iraq and other conflicts in the 80s and 90s amount to 6. So there's still, like for instance, 3 contractors missing from Operation Iraqi Freedom. So interestingly, these numbers are, I mean, this is a daunting task is the main point I want to make with this. Certainly if you look at World War II and 73,000 unaccounted for. I will say some of those numbers are a little complicated in the fact that the way they're counted, so the way the United States does it is unless there are physical remains that can be buried, can be identified and buried, their names are never taken off the list of the unaccounted for. And so many of these, and so of that 73,000, from my work at JPAC, I would hazard a guess in World War II that at least half of those, we know roughly where the bodies are, but they're not physically possible to get them. So for instance, thousands of US Navy sailors who are sitting in ships on the bottom of the ocean, or US Army Air Force's air crews who were shot down over the ocean and their planes are at the bottom of the ocean. So there's and other cases like that. So there are a number of these. So it's not as daunting as it appears, but still, it's still a lot of folks to account for. And certainly when you throw in Korea and Vietnam and all of the past conflicts of the 20th century. You might be interested to know we actually, when I was there, still had one active case from America's wars against the Barbary pirates in 1805. So you never know when someone's going to contact you with information about a family member, and that's all technically all within DPA's purview. So thankfully we didn't get too many calls about the Barbary Coast. But okay, so what I want to address, how does JPAC or DPA, how do they accomplish this mission? So there are basically 2 ways that we went about trying to account for remains. So, and again, keep in mind, I'm a historian, so we have essentially 2 sections. So there are forensic anthropologists who do the scientific work, and the historians and analysts who do the preparatory work for cases to try to suggest good cases that can then be excavated and remains identified. Okay. So the first are field missions, where we will canvass historical documents to try to locate which units, which air crews, which ships, whatever, were in certain areas, so we can kind of get a total picture of who might have been lost in what areas. And every service member from World War II has a file on them. So it's called an individual deceased personnel file, so which number over 400,000, right? And they're all kept in Suitland, Maryland. So just going through the files and trying to identify cases that have some information. So again, it takes quite a few people to go through all these kinds of things. So sometimes cases are suggested by family members, sometimes members of Congress. There's a number of ways. Sometimes people call DPAA, or in my case, JPAC directly, and suggest different approaches. And so I was a member of one of these field missions. We spent 3 weeks in France, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Germany, literally walking through farmers' fields with metal detectors. And we had contacted people in advance who had given us some information. But it was pretty remarkable to be in a field that had been plowed repeatedly, yearly since 1945, and to be able to walk through the field and pick up shell casings from a .50 caliber machine gun that you know is from an American aircraft, right? Or you can pick up pieces of skin or plexiglass from American B-17. So it is pretty, and then mixed in with that, well, if you can identify that and cordon off an area, then usually those could be suggested. Most likely there are human remains to be found there as well. So that's what many of those field missions involved. And so in fact, on the trip I was on, there were 7 cases to investigate. 3 of them, we actually found evidence of a plane crash, again, to considerable amounts of stuff that would suggest that an aircraft, parts that were in these farmers' fields that we could then recommend. And it's a long process, so I'm not sure they've been excavated yet. I've been going for about 2 years, but at least 3 that were on the list to be excavated, okay? We also got help from third-party researchers, meaning independent folks who do this work on their own. Many of these folks are fantastic. They do very comprehensive research. They go to the archives themselves. They go into the field. They interview witnesses, and many of them supplied us with some really, really solid information. There's one gentleman who was a member of the crew of the USS Honolulu on December 7th, 1941. He watched the Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor from the Honolulu, and then when he retired, spent all of his retirement years trying to help us identify all the folks who were missing from the attack on Pearl Harbor. And he does fantastic work. So when he passes away, we should honor him for all the work he's done for the cause. So, and there's some other groups too. There's a group called Bent Prop, the Bent Prop Project, that every year they take personal vacation and they spend 3 and 4 weeks in the Palau Islands diving, looking for American Navy aircraft and evidence of American soldiers and Marines that were lost in the Battle of Peleliu and the Battle of Angar and the Palau Islands. And these folks, they've been doing this for over a decade. Again, they do fantastic work. They constantly contacted us, sent us all the work that they had done, and were really integral in the identification of a number of World War II remains from operations in Palau. So again, third-party researchers can be very, very, and were very, very helpful. Right? Unfortunately, I will say, just as an aside, not all of them were quite as helpful. So there are a few who are more about trying to offer families hope than about realistic pictures. And so sometimes you have to combat a little bit of that. Or you get folks that are just attracted to the mission for the wrong reason. So for instance, one of the cases we investigated in Germany, there was a man who had called us and said he'd found an American P-51 Mustang. And he found a bone in a boot. And he said, I think I've got the pilot here from the plane, so you want to come over and investigate this case. So we went to investigate the case, and long story short was that the pilot from the plane was not missing. So the plane had crashed and the pilot had walked away. So clearly the bone belonged to someone else because this man survived the war. But when we got there, we went to the man's house to talk to him. We got to his house. He had a bizarre looking bicycle setting out parked in his driveway, which I assumed he'd sent out there for our benefit. And it was all composed of parts that he had stripped off this P-51 and made into a bicycle. All right? Which I thought, okay, this is a little odd. And then he took us into his house, and downstairs in his basement, his entire basement was full of artifacts that he had found in, which, again, there's nothing wrong with that. Until he reached into his cabinet and pulled out this odd-looking disc, sort of convex disc with a tag drilled into it, and he handed it to our team later, and just, the man at least pretended he didn't speak English, and he handed us this thing. Turned out to be the skull cap of a British pilot that he had found and taken the skull, cleaned it, and drilled a hole in it and tagged it, and been keeping it in his personal museum all these years. So anyway, enough about him. But just say there's a few that are attracted to these missions for the wrong reasons. But overwhelmingly, the third-party researchers were really helpful folks. So a lot of these field missions return a lot of remains. The other aspect of this, and this is what I worked on for the bulk of the time that I was at JPAC, were an attempt to, it's an ongoing project, to identify all of the remains that are buried as unknowns. So all these American military cemeteries, these numbers, some work in the neighborhood of about 8,500, about 8,500 folks. So we have that many sets of remains that could not be identified after the war, but again, have simply been buried as unknowns. So it's, again, an ongoing process to identify those. And it's similar in terms of canvassing archival documents, trying to figure out, based on where the bones were found. So each of these sets of remains also has its own file called an X file that gives us as much information as they knew at the time about, again, where the bones were found, what condition they were in, any kind of measurements they could take. And so that kind of work kind of works in reverse, where you already know where they were found, so then you can canvass historically and figure out what units were in that area who might even potentially be a candidate to be that set of remains. And so it's a process of winnowing that down. So the historians start with that. We do as much historical research as we can, interview witnesses, pare that number down to as small a list as we can accurately get it to. And then it's turned over to forensic anthropologists who look at the measurements of the remains and give us estimates on what age this person would have been. Are there any other kind of parameters that they can offer us? There are dentists that work on the mission as well, so Army and Navy dentists that then look at any kind of dental records. Not all the remains have them, but those that do, that's obviously very helpful too. They can look at dental records and rule out usually another number. And so this number of potentials gets winnowed down further. And if you can get it down within a reasonable range, then these cases were sent forward for exhumation. And so at that process, then the bodies are exhumed, brought to the lab, and they try to get pieces of DNA, which is not always possible. It depends on how the deceased expired, whether the condition of the remains allows that. But then you also have to contact family members and get DNA samples from them and then look for a match. And even then, what you get when you don't have nuclear DNA, when you're dealing with mitochondrial DNA, is near match. So it's not always, it's not like you have the person's DNA and you can directly match it to the remains. It's not quite that exact, right? So even then, it's better at knocking people out than it is exactly identifying them. So again, it's a little bit more complicated process than it sometimes may appear to folks looking at it from the outside. So the disinterment project that I worked on most was POW. So I dealt with the Battle of Peleliu and the accompanying Battle of Angar, and which just involved a comprehensive research on the 81st Infantry Division, the 1st Marine Division, and all of the Navy. So basically Task Force 38, the Navy Task Force, and Task Force 58 that had been there and bombed Palau a couple of times prior. So any of these folks could be candidates for unknown remains that were found on the island. Oftentimes the unknowns, they could tell that they were American service members. Sometimes they can tell what service they were part of, but often not. And so again, you have to account for all the possibilities: Army, Navy, Marines. So again, so we amassed literally thousands of pages of historical documents and tried to work through them to try to pare down who could have been where and put these things together. So again, it's a long process, but again, can be a very rewarding one. So typically, again, I think the success rate is pretty good once bodies are exhumed, partly because, and this has been criticized at times, perhaps rightfully so, but JPAC, DPAA can be a little gun shy on exhuming bodies because I think they're a little afraid that if they do, they're going to have remains that they can't identify, and then those remains set in a laboratory, and they don't always know what they can do with them, whether they can rebury them. There's some laws that they can only have them so long, and then they have to rebury them. And so sometimes they err on the side maybe of being a little too conservative, with which cases they'll pull up. But I think that's starting to change now too. So at least a lot of these cases were in the offing while I was there and have come to fruition since. But they're starting to do more mass exhumations. So they've recently received permission to exhume all of the unknown remains associated with the USS Oklahoma, for instance, which sank in Pearl Harbor. And they're doing all the bodies at once, and they have family DNA from most of the missing, and trying to pair those up as they go along. And I think they're having a pretty good success rate with that. That's what they've been doing with a lot of the Korean remains for quite some time also. And that may be the way forward with a lot of these cases, including the Palau case that I worked on, where, especially in the Pacific, where you've got, Europe is much more complicated, of course, because it's so much more fluid, but in the Pacific, if you can isolate one island and say, this island, we know these remains were found here, that it certainly limits the number of people that could possibly match those remains. And so that may be the way forward, is to exhume all the bodies associated with one island and do DNA testing and research all at one time. So, but again, that was just getting underway as I was finishing up my tenure there. So, but it is, again, it's an interesting mission. The joke we used to always make, I mean, it was a whole office full of historians that we were stuck between. If you went out the office door to the left, it was the laboratory floor that had a dozen tables with human remains on them all the time. And if you went to right, there was in fact, the back wall of my office was a cold storage facility for all the remains that had flesh still on them. So if you're superstitious, it wasn't exactly the best place to work. So if you've ever been to Hawaii, you know the Hawaiians are pretty spiritual. So some of the locals that worked with us were a little bit like, I don't show up here at night. I go home at 5 o'clock because nobody wanted to be there in that building by themselves. So it was interesting. That was just our joke anyway. But so anyway, to come back to say, I think the nature of the work and the comprehensive effort to accurately identify and bring home America's service members really is pretty unique in the world. So the only countries of which I'm aware that come close to this standard, the Netherlands actually has a pretty comprehensive effort also, although the scale is obviously much smaller than the US scale. The Germans in the last decade or two, particularly since the reunification of Germany, have also really undergone a pretty comprehensive effort to try to identify their remains, but they've got a lot of work to do. I mean, there were 45 years in which bones lay out in open fields outside Stalingrad and places like that, where it simply had never even been buried in the first place. So they got a lot of work to do. And the British have always had a fairly comprehensive effort, but that comparison highlights, I think, the importance that America places on this mission. So, for instance, the British don't have the same interest in, and I'm not criticizing it one way or the other, but they don't have the same interest in accurately identifying bodies. They simply want to account for them and move on. And so, this case best illustrates that difference. So, near the end of the war, there was an American who had parachuted out of another American bomber. And when he landed, he was by himself. He actually met up with 31 British Special Air Assault Commandos, and the 32 of them then began maneuvering together in France. They were eventually ambushed and caught by the Germans, and they took them all outside of town and the Germans executed all 32 of them and buried them in a mass grave. So after the war, the British exhumed the mass grave and got all 32 sets of remains and managed to separate them all, and they buried them all together in a French cemetery in the town that these 32 service members were protecting. The American Graves Registration Service asked for the remains back. The British simply randomly went through, picked out a set of remains, and sent them to America. We tested them, not me, of course, this was in the 1950s, but the Americans tested them. It was not the American. And so the Americans sent him back and said, could you give us the right one? This isn't the correct set of remains. And the British said, no, it's not that important, right? You got a set of remains, just bury it as the person. You know it's one of these 32, so what difference does it make? And to this day, the British will not release any of those remains. So even though they're buried in France, they're still owned, technically, because the British found them, they're owned by the British. And so it's an interesting circumstances. On the mission, we went to this French town. The French town is actually amazingly celebratory of these 32 men. They decorate their graves every year. They meticulously care for the gravesite and the cemetery. On the anniversary of the execution, they have a parade in town to honor these 32 men. So honestly, in some ways, the American who's buried there might simply be better off left in France because he's so well honored and taken care of there. But that's not my decision to make. But it does highlight the difference in that the U.S. mission is still to accurately account and bring home all of America's service members. And again, I think makes us pretty unique in that regard because it's just simply not what most of the other nations, at least the ones we worked with, did, right? So I think the other thing that's really important about this mission, too, that I've really come to appreciate even more since I left and have been working for the U.S. Army now, is that how much active duty, at least the active duty soldiers that I work with, really appreciate what DPAA does. And again, regardless of the criticisms of DPA and the way they go about certain things, and again, there's plenty of things to criticize, but still the idea that the United States as a nation wants to honor the sacrifices made by its prisoners of war and those that are unaccounted for is a very noble one. And every time I tell my students that I work for JPAC, they always say, wow, what a great mission, what a great mission. And I've heard them say how much it sort of gives them a feeling of comfort in a way to know that if they're ever lost overseas, their government will go to pretty comprehensive lengths to try to bring them home. So I think it means a lot, from my experience anyway, with current service members, that the U.S. is so dedicated to this, and rightfully so. Right? So, all right, just to finish up. So I started you off with a story about a B-17 over Germany. Right? So we picked up with this case in 2011 and managed to dig through the files and figure out of one set of human remains with 4 candidates. The anthropologist could rule out 1 because he was too old. That left us with 3. We dug through the files, found an old interview that had been conducted in the early 90s with one of the witnesses of the second bomber. The man said he'd been on the plane and that he had thrown this guy out with a parachute. We had an interviewer that went back and spoke to him in the 90s. He broke down and cried and said, no, I've been lying all these years because I was ashamed to admit that I couldn't save him. And so I left him on the plane. So it was very powerful for him. I mean, even reading the story of this man's admission was a powerful thing to read. But it was actually great for us because it meant if he was still on the plane, he didn't crash anywhere near where this body was found. And so it allowed us to rule another one off the list. And then by rooting through old cases and investigations, found that yet another one of the members on the service plane had actually parachuted out also. That left us with only 1 candidate left. So sadly, some of these things have been in the file for years, but the effort was so understaffed for so many years that no one had the time to go through it. But once we managed this, we actually, historically, and through interviews, pared it down to there's only one possible person that it could be. So didn't have much trouble getting that case approved. So they approved that, they exhumed the body, the DNA matched, as you might not be surprised to discover, and the man was identified in 2014 and buried in Florida. So all's well that ends well in that case. But I think that case really exemplifies the issues that how comprehensive the effort is and how much effort goes into, and the struggles, the obstacles that go into trying to accurately account for the remains that are again still unaccounted for from America's past wars. But also the fact that so many, I mean there are hundreds of people that work for DPAA. And again, I would highly commend most all of the folks. I mean, I knew most of the folks I worked with in Hawaii were just, again, I think we had long conversations about how important this mission is and what it means to America's service members, and people took it very seriously. So anyway, just to highlight that, I think on an occasion like this, it's important to see, again, what that means to, certainly to the current military, and how important it is to bring these folks home. So anyway, thank you very much for your time. I'd be happy to answer any questions if anybody has any. Oh, yes, ma'am, please. Okay, yeah, no, thank you. I think I heard most of that. So it's I think I heard most of your, I missed the first part of it.
I just want to thank you for you giving us this information. It's reassuring to know that even if our loved one is missing in action, that somebody is looking for them.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for saying that. And yeah, certainly, I know if you haven't been there, you don't see all the effort behind the scenes, but it's, I mean, these databases are updated constantly. Anytime new information comes in, we try to add in whatever we could, because again, when I was there, we were always looking for leads on whatever cases we could find. So anyway, yeah, thank you for your comment. So, yes, sir.
On behalf of my father, I'd like to thank you for this past year identifying Robert E. Myers and bringing him home.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mallett. We appreciate your time and expertise. I'd just like to thank everyone again for coming here today. We very much appreciate your support. We'd especially like to thank and honor those former POWs and MIA family members who have come here today. We hope you will come out and join us Friday at our ceremony at Andersonville National Historic Site to pay special honor to the POWs and MIAs. We will have a MIA family member representative make a few remarks about that topic, and a former POW member of the crew of the USS Pueblo make remarks also about their experience and share some of their stories. So thank you again for coming, and everyone have a good day.